As dawn broke, the Colosseum was already stirring, its colossal arches capturing the first faint rays of light, while the blood of yesterday clung to the stone like a persistent shadow. Underneath the stands, vendors bellowed for trade, their baskets overflowing with olives and diluted wine, prepared for a crowd yet to arrive. Beyond the heavily barred gates, handlers forced half-famished beasts into position, lions with ribs showing starkly through their hides, elephants stomping in fury, and panthers tearing at the cage bars with their claws. From the tunnels echoed the sharp ring of swords, not the sounds of practice, but the testing of steel meant for the day's grim work, as a low murmur from outside swelled into a deafening roar from tens of thousands of arriving Romans. They were hungry for the one thing their empire had perfected above all else: death, masterfully disguised as entertainment. The Roman arena was never just about sport. It was a laboratory engineered for cruelty, where emperors would flood the sands for mock naval battles and deliberately starve wild animals to amplify the spectacle. Prisoners were compelled to reenact myths that concluded not with applause, but with their very real deaths. None of this was by chance. It was state policy, woven into the very fabric of Rome's control, and the cheers from the stands were a public pledge of loyalty, echoing through this grim chapter of dark history. And today, we are stepping directly into that darkness. These are the most savage, most inhumane spectacles of the arena that pushed the boundaries, even for ancient Rome. From gore-soaked funeral ceremonies to executions staged as grand theatre, we will uncover the dark history of how an empire built its glory by turning human suffering into a spectator sport. Before we delve deeper, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss our next exploration of history's most shadowed corners. Now, find your seat. The gates are beginning to open. The very first gladiatorial battle in Rome didn't start with imperial ceremony or a procession of emperors. It began at a funeral in 264 BC. The sons of Decimus Junius Brutus Scaever opted to honor their father not with monuments or eulogies, but with the shedding of blood. They equipped 3 pairs of enslaved men and commanded them to fight to the death right in the Forum Boarium, a cattle market saturated with the smell of livestock and smoke. This was not entertainment. It was a solemn duty, a munus. It was a sacred obligation owed to the spirit of the deceased, with roots extending far beyond Rome itself. In Campania, warriors were sacrificed at gravesites to pacify vengeful spirits. In time, this ritual killing transformed into organized combat. The dead no longer required random sacrifices, but instead demanded duels between chosen fighters. The Samnites, who were once Rome's most ferocious adversaries, frequently held such contests, and the Roman aristocracy enthusiastically adopted the tradition. Burying a man with riches displayed wealth, but burying him amid a spectacle of blood was a demonstration of absolute power. Yet, funerals were merely the genesis. By the 3rd century BC, Rome's ruling class recognized how these brutal fights could do more than just pay tribute to the dead. They could stabilize the political landscape. Religious festivals, once reverent affairs for Jupiter, slowly began to incorporate gladiatorial games. The Senate presented it as an act of piety, but the populace understood the reality. It was state-sanctioned brutality, carefully orchestrated to maintain the loyalty of the masses. Even the armor worn by the fighters told a story of conquest, featuring the Samnite with his imposing shield, the Thracian with his uniquely curved blade, and the Gaul with his formidable broadsword. To watch them bleed was to witness Rome's military triumphs reenacted, blow by bloody blow. Death itself was turned into propaganda, and as the violence escalated, the venues expanded. Makeshift wooden arenas were replaced by permanent stone amphitheaters, veritable temples dedicated to violence, where thousands could congregate. The games were no longer a private affair for grieving families. They now belonged entirely to the state. Every drop of blood spilled on the sand conveyed the same undeniable message. Rome held dominion over men, over armies, and even over death itself. No one at the time could have possibly imagined how far this obsession would spiral. What began as a ritual sacrifice had mutated into grotesque theatre, and a solemn duty had become a national obsession. Rome had stumbled upon a new and powerful weapon, control not only over the living, but over the very meaning of death. And once that power was unleashed, that door was never closed again. The crowd's roar wasn't only for men. Sometimes, it thundered for the beasts. Creatures were dragged from the furthest reaches of the known world, lions from North Africa, leopards from the Caucasus, crocodiles from the Nile, and even giraffes hauled across vast deserts. These animals were not showcased as natural wonders. They were condemned to be prey in a gruesome carnival of death, which the Romans chillingly called venationes, or hunts. This wasn't a contest of survival, but a raw display of domination. A brutal chapter in Rome's dark history and proof that the empire could annihilate the wild for pleasure. Julius Caesar himself set the precedent in 46 BC, when he paraded a giraffe, the very first of its kind ever witnessed in Europe, which they named a camelopard. It was deemed half camel and half leopard, as Rome possessed no name for such a marvel, but its uniqueness was irrelevant. The animal was never meant to be admired. Instead, it was thrown into the arena to be torn to pieces, sending an unmistakable message. If Rome could capture and destroy the most exotic creatures alive, it could conquer any nation on earth. This carnage only intensified when the Colosseum opened in 80 AD, where Emperor Titus reputedly presided over the deaths of over 9,000 animals in a single festival. Archaeologists have unearthed bones scarred with the marks of deliberate starvation, grim evidence that lions and bears were intentionally weakened beforehand to guarantee a swift and bloody spectacle for the crowd. Even elephants, the very beasts that once struck terror into Roman legions under Hannibal, were herded into the arena and butchered to the sound of applause. Behind the curtain of entertainment, the logistics were a theatre of their own. Exotic animals were trapped, dragged across scorching deserts, and meticulously kept alive just long enough to face their preordained doom. Caravans dragged cages through searing sands, delivering living victims to a city that craved fresh blood with each new dawn. Fleets ferried them down the Nile, and handlers risked life and limb simply to transport these living trophies to Rome. Encountering a panther in its natural habitat was perilous enough, but to watch one erupt from a cage before 50,000 roaring spectators, that was imperial power made terrifyingly real. Each animal served as a living monument to conquest, a testament to an empire whose reach was boundless, and some emperors even transformed these hunts into their own personal stages. Commodus, the most flamboyant showman to ever rule Rome, would stride into the arena costumed as Hercules, personally slaughtering hundreds of animals for the crowd. He wanted to appear as a god among beasts, but the reality was plain to see. A man of fragile ego armed with a bow, propped up by contests that were almost always rigged. The animals were frequently chained, injured, or half-starved to ensure the emperor could revel in a guaranteed victory. And as for the people, they cheered. This wasn't from genuine admiration, but from the chilling understanding that when the emperor is on the hunt, silence could be a death sentence. But beneath the roar of the crowd, a quieter, more lasting tragedy was unfolding, as ancient historians like Pliny the Elder documented how entire species began to vanish from their native lands. They were decimated after decades of relentless Roman slaughter, with lions, leopards, and even elephants driven to the brink of extinction to satisfy the empire's insatiable hunger for spectacle. The Colosseum was more than a theatre of death. It was an ecological wrecking ball, but for the Roman state, the concept of extinction was utterly meaningless. What mattered was upholding the illusion that nature itself could be captured, subjugated, and ultimately destroyed for sport, with every lifeless body on the arena floor serving as just another brick in the edifice of imperial power. Now, when you imagine a gladiator, you likely picture two equally matched warriors engaged in a noble duel. The reality of this dark history was far more perverse. Rome's entertainment thrived on imbalance, on contests meticulously engineered for maximum cruelty. Bizarre weapons were forged, absurd rules were imposed, and fights were staged that were impossible for some to win, as many victims weren't even fighters at all. Condemned criminals and prisoners of war were thrust into the arena, sometimes dressed as clowns, given wooden swords, and sent to be slaughtered by professional killers. The crowd would roar with laughter as these doomed souls flailed and fell, witnessing a public execution cleverly disguised as entertainment. Even the weapons themselves told a story. The retiarius, armed with a fisherman's net and trident, faced the secutor, whose smooth, round helmet was specifically designed to let the net slide off. This wasn't a simple test of skill. It was manufactured suspense, a living riddle of whether the net would trap its prey or the sword would find its mark. The Roman public devoured this tension, even when the fight was as carefully choreographed as a theatre production, and as the years went on, the numbers only grew more obscene. At times, a lone gladiator was pitted against overwhelming odds, while on other days, entire cohorts clashed in mock battles, transforming the arena floor into a grim tableau of crimson and steel, amidst shattered shields and broken bodies. But when the novelty of simple combat began to fade, Rome's appetite for spectacle demanded something more. And so, in the 1st century AD, female gladiators, the gladiatrices, emerged onto the blood-soaked sand. Though writers like Juvenal scorned them, historical records confirm they fought fiercely, even against dwarves, against wild beasts, and even against one another. Their very presence challenged Roman gender norms, yet it only reinforced a fundamental truth of Rome's dark history. No one, neither man nor woman, was exempt from the empire's insatiable hunger for spectacle. Even the very equipment, like the helmets, was often an instrument of torment. Some were designed to obscure vision or muffle sound, forcing combatants to stagger about half-blind, much to the roaring delight of the crowd. Others were so crushingly heavy that simply lifting one's head was a battle in itself. In this world, armor was not always for protection. Sometimes it was a form of punishment. Then came the propaganda pageants, where gladiators were costumed as the empire's barbarian foes, compelled to reenact the defeats of Rome's enemies. Their scripted, inevitable demise served as a brutal reminder to all that the empire was invincible. Each mismatched fight, every bizarre pairing, and every convention-defying spectacle was meticulously engineered to keep the populace enthralled, submissive, and always clamoring for more. The Colosseum's dark history is one of constant innovation, but its inventions were always new forms of cruelty, constantly in pursuit of the next shocking thrill. As midday approached, with the sand already stained from the morning's duels and the audience growing restless, the nature of the games would shift dramatically. Combat subsided, replaced by a grotesque form of theatre where death was the main event. The Romans called it damnatio ad bestias, or condemnation by the beasts. For those sentenced, this was no trial. It was a pre-written tragedy they were powerless to escape. Criminals, military deserters, rebellious slaves, and prisoners of war all were cast as unwilling actors in public executions, masquerading as mythological tales. The punishment was often tailored to fit the crime. Thieves might be torn asunder by wolves, arsonists consumed by flames, and traitors cast to the lions. Each gruesome scene was a morality play, its script written in blood. The sheer scale of this slaughter could defy belief. During Emperor Trajan's celebration of his Dacian victory, thousands of captives were dispatched over 103 consecutive, relentless days. This was not chaotic carnage. It was meticulously organized, paced like the acts of a macabre play, with each death engineered to hold the audience in suspense for the next horror. The true stars of this nightmare were the animals. Lions starved into a state of frenzy before being unleashed. Bears were chained in pits and provoked into a rage, while prized leopards were set upon trembling victims. The terrible uncertainty whether the beast would kill quickly or toy with its prey kept the spectators roaring for more. Sometimes, this cruelty was cloaked in legend, with prisoners forced to portray doomed mythological heroes. They became Orpheus, torn limb from limb by wild animals, or Prometheus, chained while vultures circled above. These were no longer just stories. They were performances drenched in blood, with the arena sand as their stage. In Rome, death was not merely an end. It was often a theatrical production, a gruesome, mocking theatre. For the condemned, it was not enough to simply die. They were compelled to perform their own demise, enacting Rome's great myths with their own flesh and blood. Executions transformed into grotesque plays, where real bodies replaced actors' masks, and the script invariably concluded in agony. But the cruelty extended far beyond wild animals. Crucifixion, a method adopted from the East, was staged for entertainment right inside the arena. Men and women were nailed to wooden beams as vendors sold wine and children played just feet away. Fire, too, became part of the spectacle. Prisoners were made to wear the tunica molesta, a garment saturated in pitch, and then set alight, becoming human torches that writhed as smoke billowed towards the sky. As the writer Tertullian bitterly observed, they became living torches. This aspect of Rome's dark history reveals these killings were more than just morbid entertainment. They were instruments of propaganda, stark warnings carved into living flesh. The message was clear: defy Rome, and you would die slowly, with tens of thousands as your audience. Yet, Not every Roman could endure such sights. The philosopher Seneca lamented that these midday slaughters corrupted the soul, making men more savage with every life they saw extinguished. But his objections were lost in the roar of a crowd that craved not justice, but the sheer spectacle of suffering, a chilling chapter in Rome's dark history. At times, the emperor's ambitions outgrew the arena, demanding entire oceans be brought into the city for mock naval battles, or naumachiae, staged on a truly mind-bending scale. Here, the very water was weaponized. Julius Caesar established this tradition in 46 BC, excavating a massive basin by the Tiber River. He flooded it and launched real warships, crewed by thousands of condemned prisoners forced to enact the roles of rival navies and fight to the death. These were not performers. They were men sentenced to die for the entertainment of others, as arrows, catapults, and swords transformed the artificial lake into a floating abattoir, and Augustus only amplified the madness. In 2 BC, he commissioned a basin nearly 2,000 by 1,200 Roman feet, supplied by its own dedicated aqueduct, the Aqua Alsiatina, just to stage these aquatic horrors. 30 warships clashed within its confines. Each vessel was packed with prisoners who knew they would never touch dry land again. The statement was undeniable. Rome could conjure seas from nothing, bending even nature to its will. By 52 AD, the Emperor Claudius took it even further, draining the vast Lake Fucine simply to host another Naumachia, where captives met him with a now legendary salute. Morituri te salutant, those who are about to die. Salute you, a line that has haunted the annals of dark history, whether it was a scripted plea or a cry of genuine despair. It perfectly captured the utter hopelessness of men, reduced to mere stage props. Fire, too, was woven into these macabre theatrical productions. Victims were forced into pitch-soaked tunics and cast in the roles of tragic heroes, meeting a fiery demise, like Hercules being consumed by a poisoned robe, or Mucius Scaevola proving his loyalty by thrusting his hand into the flames. The audience roared with laughter as these heroes shrieked in agony, their courage twisted into a grotesque parody, their legends desecrated and reduced to ash. Even the Colosseum's very architecture was designed to serve this Roman hunger for absolute control. Under the emperors, Titus and later Domitian, engineers installed complex channels beneath the arena floor. These systems could flood the stage for intimate naval displays one moment, then drain it completely for land-based combat the next. Cruelty had officially become an engineering marvel. Water, fire, and human flesh all were just materials in Rome's grand theatre of power, used to drown captives, to fashion men into living torches, and to twist cherished myths into brutal executions. This was the ultimate expression of power. The emperors were not content to rule humanity. They presented themselves as masters of the elements. By the late 1st century, executions had transcended mere punishment. They were elaborately scripted performances, dripping with a horrifying creativity that warped cultural stories into instruments of terror. Consider the inaugural games of the Colosseum in 80 AD. The poet Martial documented a condemned man forced to play Orpheus, the mythical musician who could charm wild beasts with his song. In the legend, animals would lay peacefully at his feet. In the arena, a bear was unleashed mid-performance, which promptly tore the musician apart. Art was debased into a blood sport, beauty into butchery. Another victim was made to portray Daedalus, the brilliant inventor who escaped Crete on wings of wax and feathers, hoisted into the air on a crude flying machine. He hung there for a fleeting moment before the contraption failed, sending him plummeting to the starving beasts below. Martial dryly joked that the man must have wished for real wings, a poet's wit concealing a man's final, horrifying moments. Perhaps the most depraved of all was the reenactment of the myth of Pasiphae, who was cursed with an unnatural desire for a bull. One spectacle staged her notorious coupling with the aid of a mechanical beast. This act was followed by her public execution, a horrific display that fused death, degradation, and a perverse form of entertainment, turning a cautionary tale into a live spectacle of debasement. The underlying message was brutally clear. Rome possessed its myths with the same absolute authority that it possessed its people. Heroes and villains, gods and mortals, no figure was sacred enough to escape being recast as a pawn in a meticulously choreographed pageant of death. For the spectators, it was a diversion. For the condemned, a costumed, agonizing end. For the Roman state, it was living propaganda, a demonstration that it held the power to rewrite the very soul of its culture. Inside the Colosseum, stories were not written in ink or carved in stone. They were seared into skin and shattered against bone, all to the sound of thunderous applause, before silence finally claimed the blood-soaked sand. The boundary between governance and raw, obsessive cruelty had vanished. It reached a point where an emperor's fleeting mood could determine who lived, who died, and in what manner. The notoriously unstable Caligula provides a terrifying example. Having run out of beasts to kill during one of his games, he nonchalantly ordered his guards to seize a section of the audience and throw them into the arena instead. Spectators arrived anticipating bloodshed, only to become unwilling participants in the horror. Nero, completely enthralled by his own myth, treated the arena as his private stage. Condemned prisoners were costumed as tragic figures from mythology, only to be executed in ways that grotesquely mirrored their scripted dooms. While Nero dared to call it art, Rome whispered that it was madness. And then came Commodus, the ultimate showman emperor. Disguised as Hercules, he would storm into the Colosseum armed with a club and bow, slaughtering hundreds of animals, often maimed in advance, to guarantee a successful kill and thunderous applause. He even billed the public treasury for these grotesque performances, bleeding the state dry while coercing cheers from a terrified crowd. Still not satisfied, he would face gladiators himself, but only after every single advantage was rigged in his favor, a truly shameful chapter in the empire's dark history. Losing was simply not an option, and applause was mandatory. Domitian wielded the arena as a weapon of paranoia, staging macabre midnight hunts by torchlight to keep the citizens of Rome perpetually uneasy, never knowing when amusement might curdle into terror. Even the so-called good emperors were not immune. Trajan, remembered as a just and capable leader, commemorated a military victory with 103 straight days of games, where thousands of deaths were simply folded into a grand celebration of power. Spectacle fed the imperial ego, but it always carried a heavy price. Both Caligula and Commodus met violent ends, remembered not for their statesmanship but for a legacy of theatre written in blood. The very arena that elevated them to godlike status also exposed the depths of their madness. Yet not every Roman cheered. Philosophers, poets, and early Christians left behind a much quieter, more critical record, one that saw the decay festering just beneath the gleaming marble. Seneca confessed that the midday executions had hardened him, stripping away his empathy rather than purifying his soul. This violence, he warned, seeped past the arena walls, poisoning daily life, a chilling aspect of Rome's dark history. Decades earlier, Cicero had praised genuine courage, yet condemned cruelty for its own sake, although even he had to admit the mob demanded these games as proof of a ruler's generosity. To govern was to feed the beast. For early Christians, the amphitheatre was a stage for both their persecution and their unwavering faith. Those who refused to renounce their beliefs were thrown to the lions or burned alive, their final moments twisted into a form of mass entertainment. The writer Tertullian called the shows seedbeds of cruelty, a damning indictment of an empire that cheered injustice as a sport. Economically, the games were a vortex that devoured fortunes. By the late empire, rulers would bankrupt the state in a desperate chase for spectacles grand enough to outshine their predecessors. What had once been a flex of imperial strength became a hollow act of desperation. Culturally, this insatiable appetite dulled Rome's moral edge. Citizens who had once honored discipline now demanded nothing more than cheap bread and endless circuses. The satirist Juvenal famously mocked this hunger with the phrase panem et circenses. To him, this craving for spectacle was a stark betrayal of how far Rome had drifted from its republican foundations, even as its frontiers began to crack and its coffers ran dry. In time, the arenas crumbled. By the 5th century, the Colosseum, still colossal, stood as a hollow monument, its blood-soaked sands finally silent, its deafening roars consigned to memory. But the moral questions never faded. Could a society that trained its people to revel in the suffering of others truly endure? The verdict of history suggests otherwise. Today, the Colosseum looms over the city, scarred but magnificent. Walk its subterranean tunnels, and you might still hear the echoes, the clash of iron, the roaring of beasts, and 50,000 voices rising as one. It is easy to admire the stone. It is far harder and more honest to remember its true purpose. A stage for cruelty, rehearsed until it became utterly normal. Rome's arenas were never merely about blood. They were about control, a mechanism for shaping how citizens thought, laughed, and ultimately obeyed. Every hunt, every execution, every myth, reborn in screams, served the exact same end: to make power look eternal. And that is the warning carved into the very ruins themselves. A civilization that glorifies violence will eventually crumble under the weight of its own applause. So we ask you, which of these spectacles, the staged hunts, the human torches, or the emperors drunk on their own power, best reveals the true nature of Rome's darkest soul? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this dive into Rome's brutal entertainments has gripped you, make sure you hit subscribe. That way, you won't miss our next journey into the shadows of dark history. Until then, remember that while the Colosseum may be quiet now, its echoes of cruelty still seem to breathe through the very stones.